So good evening, everyone from Mumbai. My name is ElsaMarie DSilva, and I am the founder of Red Dot Foundation. At Red Dot Foundation, we work at the intersection of gender, tech and data, community engagement, and urbanism. And we primarily work on prevention of sexual and gender-based violence. We have a crowd map called Safe City, where you can anonymously document your experience of sexual and gender-based violence. And the data is available open source for anyone to use anywhere in the world. It's a global app. And we have people from all over the world using the data to make their cities, neighborhoods, communities, and campuses safer. And we can have a discussion about that later, but today's discussion is how do you make safe spaces in the phygital world? And phygital is a word that I recently came across. It is a combination of the physical and the digital world, which we are all familiar with. We are now in the third year of the pandemic, and technology has become part and parcel of our lives. But then we must remind ourselves that we are privileged. And as people who are privileged, we also should keep in mind that there are lots of people who are being left out constantly in the system. But whilst we navigate these worlds, both the physical and the digital, we experience challenges, but there are also opportunities. So one of the challenges is that we have connectivity issues, but then we also carry the bad practices that we adopt in the physical world onto the digital world. And that is hate crime, trolling, sexism, and also violence in many ways. So we are here to explore not only the challenges, but also some of the good practices that are being done. And we will also love to hear from you as we go along. So we are going to try and make it interactive. But now we will start the discussion. We have 4 panelists, but I noticed that 2 of our American panelists are having difficulties joining, so we'll just give them a moment. But we have with us Ms. Bishakha Datta, who's the Executive Director, Point of View, an amazing organization that we love partnering with. We have Advocate Nappinai, advocate at the Supreme Court of India and the founder of CyberSaathi, and she's also an amazing person to collaborate with, and she's also on our board of advisors. We have Dr. Andrea Adams, who's Assistant Professor, University of the District of Columbia. She's an ethicist. And Mr. James Felton Keith, who's the founder and CEO of InclusionScore. So let's welcome Bishakha and Nappinai. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you, Elsa. Yeah, good to be here. Thank you.
Likewise, Elsa. Lovely to be here. And as always, now I am sharing screen with 2 great friends. So yes, wonderful to be here.
Yeah. So we'll start off the discussion, and when James and Andrea come in, we will just add them, because we have 1 hour, and I'm conscious that in the digital space, this 1 hour can be very taxing on many. So thank you everyone for joining in, and please feel free to use the chat section to tell us, your thoughts, because this is a space that some people are comfortable in, and there are many who are actually not comfortable either. So first, let's start off with you, Bishakha. You at Point of View have done a lot of work, even pre-pandemic, on digital spaces, safety, and the intersection with the LGBTQ community, as well as people with disabilities, in addition to gender. So can you share some of these challenges that you've seen and noticed in the research that you've done and the work you've done? And let's take it from there.
Sure, thanks so much, Elsa. I think one of the things we found is that gender norms or rules for different genders really governs sort of life phygitally, right? So both in the physical world and the digital world. And I think one of the sort of really terrible rules that many genders face is that technology is not for your gender, right? So if you're a girl or a woman, it's like, well, technology is not meant for you. Therefore, access is hard. And we see this particularly in low-income families where mobile phones are shared very much during the pandemic, that, girls or daughters, etc., would get the phone last and for like very little time, couldn't really manage their education, etc. I think one of the things we've seen with queer communities, and this again really got highlighted the last couple of years, is that, particularly during pandemics and lockdowns, when you're at home all the time and your phone is lying around, you can inadvertently get outed, right? So in many families in India where queer identities are not accepted, people actually ended up getting outed to their families, which then made it dangerous for them to be at home, basically, right? And that's kind of a classical Phygital thing, because something like from a digital angle, it's a data privacy and data protection issue. But what happened was when that, when you face this kind of inadvertent outing and your sexuality is stigmatized and your family members don't accept it, then you can actually end up facing sort of harassment, violence, including being like, so many things physically. So I think the complicated thing with Phygital is that you have to look at both constantly and see how each affects the other and, deal with both of them. With people with disabilities, we work mainly with women with disabilities. I think the big issue is still really not having enough accessibility online, right? So not being able to participate significantly, etc. That's kind of some of what our research has shown. We can talk some more later.
And I remember, Bishakha, one of our earliest collaborations was with these young girls in a school in Mumbai. And one of the girls said that, she kept receiving, this was pre-pandemic, and she kept receiving, missed calls from a strange number. And her parents confiscated her phone because they thought that she was up to no good, but she didn't even know who was calling. And the result was actually that she didn't have access to the WhatsApp group where her friends were sharing class notes. And that came up that, she was losing out on all this extracurricular activity, right? That was happening there.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that in. I'm amazed that you remember that. Actually kind of got stuck in my head too. And we've seen this again, during the pandemic, that if you come, particularly if you come from, say, a low-income community and you have like a old-style feature phone, right? Then the harassment you face if you're a girl or a young woman is very much through blank calls, where basically the same number keeps calling you again and again and again and again. And because it's like tech is anyway not for girls and that kind of thing, your family doesn't support you. And we see that actually in so many kinds of, if you think about it, in so many kinds of physical harassment and abuse also, right? Like girls in India always being told, don't go out at night, don't right? So it's always like you are blamed for what is happening to you and then further restrictions on you.
Thanks, Bishakha, and welcome, James. We kicked off the discussion because, we have just 1 hour and this is such an interesting topic, but welcome.
Well, thanks for having me. Well, even what you all were talking about was interesting. I didn't know about the, young women in the blank phone calls. So this is harassment. Who's doing it though? These are like predators.
It's often somebody in the community, right? Like it might be but it's the same number keeps calling and calling and calling. And, often the person won't speak. So after a point, what happens is you get scared to answer the phone, or you block the number and then the calls come from another number. There was a case actually where a rural journalist finally complained, and then they found that the guy who was harassing her, basically the cops, went in and they found that the guy who was harassing her had 200 SIM cards. So this is an exceptional case. Maybe, I don't know, maybe not exceptional. Nappinai can talk about that. But he basically used these different SIM cards to harass women. And, he would just keep changing his cards, etc. So this is kind of obviously at a much higher level.
Sure, sure.
Yeah, but it's fairly common actually.
But what it says is that even as we progress, technology progresses, people who want to commit a crime will find a way to commit a crime. So that guy had 200 SIM cards, but there was another case in India where he lays with the guy. So in India, with the low income community, they buy prepaid SIMs. And this guy was buying the numbers from the retailer. They had some kind of deal, and he was harassing all the women. And in many places, the family says, why do you need a phone? If you have a phone, then you deserve to go through this harassment. Or even there was I think a minister who said you deserve to be raped. So, there is this association that a woman with a mobile phone is up to no good. But the example why I remembered Bishakha is because, we take our phones for granted, but there is somebody whose lifeline or education depends on that access. And, of course, that's just one example, but there's so many that we can share. So Nappinai, you're a lawyer. So in India, we have a lot of legislations, and you're a firm believer that, we should go by the legal system to get redressal or remedies. So what is the gap that you've seen? Because on one hand, you have so many crimes being perpetrated, and on the other hand, people feel that they don't get justice.
And probably they are not also, Elsa, unfortunately, because that's the pitfalls with following the system. And yet I still advocate that every victim should approach the system and get their remedies. Two reasons for that is, we always talk about how systems don't work. But unless we make it work, then what are systems there for? And the second thing is, particularly in cases like this of harassment of women or girls, young girls, etc., most often, either a family member or a friend resorts to vigilante justice. It neither helps the victim nor the person resorting to vigilante justice, nor the criminal, right? Everybody loses. And therefore, my emphasis on this. Now, here is the interesting fact that transgresses, or since we are talking about the Phygital and the Phygital divide as well as those intersections, this is what happens. Now, the first part is all the things that Bishakha talked about. And, you and I have come across so many things that youngsters have shared, not necessarily just girls. Youngsters have shared in the way they've been harassed, etc. The first part of it is, at some level, not just amongst youngsters, but amongst everybody, there is a big divide in their mental framework towards what they do physically and what they do on the virtual world. They genuinely believe that what they do on virtual worlds or the digital world is not real. So there is also this assumption, oh, but it happened there, why should I be punished for it? They don't even realize that there are punishments for this. So from a criminal's perspective, and unfortunately, and this is something that that's another reason that CyberSaathi focuses in terms of awareness about laws and remedies, is not just to help victims, but also to stop crimes from being committed. Because most people may do it because they don't realize the consequences. And if you highlight the consequences, hopefully, some deterrence will come in place. Unfortunately, even amongst the system, often there is this misunderstanding. When I say system, I mean police and courts, etc., that they don't understand the kind of impact that digital crimes have on victims, including physical impact, be it on their mental health, psychological, and as you just mentioned, about the girl losing her digital freedom with the mobile being taken away. So that becomes a physical impact also in many ways. So unless all stakeholders understand what are the risks involved, the system cannot function. And the other reason why systems fail is we are using legacy laws and processes and dealing with digital crimes. So legacy laws are glacial. They take their own sweet time to, get to a conclusion. Often they don't reach a conclusion at all. At some point of time, parties decide we have had enough and they just settle and move away. And when I was writing my book, this is what I saw, that most often than not, especially when it pertains to offenses against women and children, the victims or the victims' families seem to prefer to just settle and move on. From my experience as a lawyer, unfortunately, I can tell you 95% of the crimes do not even come to the stage of the system because victims just want to be protected. They don't want to prosecute. And unless they prosecute, the numbers are not going to reflect reality, which is why we have a situation where we talk about crimes happening every second or many crimes happening every second. But you also have an NCRB statistics which talks about thousands of crimes being committed. Obviously, there is a big disconnect. And according to me, that disconnect is a reflection of failure of justice. That is a reflection that the victims or their families have lost faith or did not, to begin with itself, have faith in systems. And this is also something that will then feed the criminal. The criminal starts thinking, if somebody has 200 SIM cards, how did he get it? The interesting part is, of course, I've come across many cases, handled many cases where it is 200 and more, but invariably that kind of investment is done by a criminal. I use the word consciously, because criminals also have to invest money to commit crimes. So they invest to do a financial fraud. Very rarely you come across someone who would do it to commit a physical crime. And yes, assault or harassment of women or children through digital spaces is a physical crime and not a virtual crime. So for somebody to invest that kind of money, it is clearly indicative of a habitual offender. And when I'm talking about a habitual offender like this and the money investment, unfortunately, the way the systems are working now, it is not even that much money that a person has to invest. As Bishakha mentioned, there was this case where, which exposed what is happening, the racket. And that's why you have now various fail-safes which people are trying to build into KYCs also. One is when you're giving your documents for KYC for the uninitiated is know your customer. So which banks and telecom and companies and every service provider is supposed to do. They ask you to sign and specify the date and also what is the purpose for which you're giving. Because when you give your KYC, for instance, for getting your prepaid card from a small bunk shop or like a tabernery or something, this tiny shop, that person can misuse your documents and probably already has in terms of issuing additional SIM cards. Or you can have multiple cards or numbers by cloning someone else's numbers. You can also do it through a lot of VoIP apps, which will allow you to make it seem like, let's say, you are calling me to threaten me. Usually I would say it the other way. Nowadays, I'm playing it safe. I'd rather make the other person the criminal and me the victim here, right? So these are all possibilities. So we can't stop the criminal. But if we can show that law works, hopefully we can deter the criminal. And if we can show that law works by punishing and doing it really fast, without frustrating a victim to say, okay, I've had enough of it. Even the victims who are coming forward, if they're going to give up on the system, that's not a good process. So we really need to build trust in systems. And for that to happen, we must have processes which are as fast as today's digital world is, today's millennials are, and today's requirements are.
Thank you for that, Nappinai. And you raised lots of points along with Bishakha. So one is, the socio-cultural factors. Again, the norms in the physical world transcending into the virtual world, then, the lack of sensitivity, the lack of education, the long processes, the laws keeping up with the fast digital transformation, and so on and so forth. So that brings me to James. You're a risk specialist, and in this Phygital world where more and more, everyone's now talking about the metaverse, and We don't understand it. We don't even know what it's capable of, right? We are just at the start of it. So we have no idea 10 years from now, what is our world going to look like? As it is, because of the pandemic, we have been forced to, get onto our digital devices, whether we like it or not. And more, this is going to be part of our lifestyles, I would say. So when laws can't keep up with the rapid transformation, when education doesn't cover all this, and when there's a clear digital divide, how can we actually progress, and how can we keep ourselves and our communities safe in such a space?
Well, first, let me start by saying I love the word Phygital. I had never heard that word until you emailed it out, but I like it. Am I getting an echo in here? I had to move to this room to get good internet. I'm in Johannesburg today. But what I would say is we need all three prongs as infrastructure. So I wholly believe that there is a use case for legal and policy. There's a use case for education, and there's a use case for more technology and business. And they all bounce off of each other to create the society that we've inherited. And I would say I am particularly worried about the metaverse and what it will mean, because I'm one of those millennials who may be aged out of whatever the metaverse is, because I'm not in, right? I was on Facebook first, like the first 3 months, but now it's old, right? I don't game. I don't have an avatar. I don't buy stuff inside of the metaverse, et cetera. And I do think that every time a significant technological change happens, it changes the way we communicate, and that's what changes cultures. I think the difference between all of our different age groups, no matter what country we're in, is the point at which our group stopped communicating the same way as the new group. So like when the smartphone happened, or before that, when the telephone happened, or you name it. And so I think when we think about the risk that come in this new space, whether it be the metaverse or the current space, I think we should assume first that all of the biases around gender, race, religion, orientation, disability, economic class, language barrier, location barrier, all the different types of diversity that make us up, they will come into play in those spaces. And so I think first things first is we have to be vigilant, but our communication strategy across the practitioners and across the new people, the young people coming up who have no idea what we're doing, it has to be streamlined in how we communicate the dangers of the world. So every time we identify a new dangerous scenario, I think the regular communications apparatus of our countries have to be deployed to educate ourselves around what risk is, what dangers are. I think, the journalistic community is a technology that we can use to communicate risk, because when we think about risk management, there's definitely a technological piece, whether we're talking about cybersecurity or any other type of risk. But the majority of cyber risks, for instance, are like 90% of cyber risks of any sort, whether they're P2P interactions or breaches, or B2C, like business to consumer or business to business, whether we're talking about people interacting with people or people interacting with institutions, more than 90% of the flaws or the errors that happen are human errors. And it's because of how we want to culturally trust or engage our peers, whether we're doing that digitally or physically. And so I think constantly educating our communities about how the world works is the most important thing that we can do. But I will say, on the bright side, it is the most important thing that we've always done. And we have, for as many sociopaths as there are, and that's the way I like to think about any of these criminals. They're not just always just incentivized to be bad actors. There are layers. I think some of the folks at the top who do the most harm are just outright sociopaths, and we have to build infrastructure to manage them. But when we think about them existing, and they have always existed, humanity has still thrived, right? We have 8 billion people on the planet nearly. We have 6 billion devices at these people. And in the next 20 years, we'll have 8 billion devices, meaning cell phones that connect us all. And as we all become connected, we will still have to manage sociopathy. at the local area, at the hyper-local region, and at the global, at the global scale. And so I think the best way is to really start to look at law as code. We have to continually update the code of law so that we understand what we are managing, what we are monitoring, so that we can start to remedy problems, as it was, made apparent earlier, fast, where people aren't discouraged from interacting with the system, because all we have, and this may be too far, but this is how I think about it, all we have as humans is the system. We have continually picked away and built onto this system of how we are interconnected. And for better or worse, and I know that we can identify a lot of the worst, we continue to exist and the population continues to grow. So I think, the way we manage risk, number one, or risk management, number one, is first making folks aware. So we need a large apparatus, a large budget to educate people about what's happening. That's number one. Number two, we have to create more data on how people exist. And we have to be vigilant in fighting for that data to keep it away from the sociopaths so that it's distributed in the right way. And I think the reason that the data is important is because the more we identify ourselves, the better we are able to allocate solutions to problems. I think our sort of digital ethos, again, no matter what region we're in, should really be the idea that individuals are at their best when they identify with a community, and we can create that technologically, phygitally, we can create it physically and digitally. But the second part is that communities are only at their best when they identify all of their individuals. And the key word there is the word only. And the idea that only is that it's a continuous cycle of trying to more micro identify ourselves and what problems we may have, to remedy, our ability to thrive. I think about this sort of new movement that's starting to happen around mental health. When I was a kid, no one talked about mental health. It wasn't a thing. It was just like, stop crying, right? And now we're realizing that it's really taking a toll on people's lives, right? Across the board, no matter who they are. So, we're coming into a new era, and these people who are younger than the millennials, because as a millennial, I would say millennials are 40 now. Young kids think I'm an old man, 19-year-olds, they're like, this old man, he doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. So again, it's just making sure that we identify who these young people are, better identify who we are, and continue to engage them, because I will say it is difficult to keep track of what they're doing. I have no idea what they're doing on the internet now. I still thought Facebook was in vogue, but it's not. So I think, cybersecurity or security in general, or risk management in general, is difficult. The last thing I'll say about from a risk management standpoint is I do think we can engage the financial infrastructure of the world a lot better to incentivize more risk management. So, when I go around the world talking about risk and talking about technology and data a lot, and I don't think a lot of people realize that I really work in the insurance industry. And for every type of risk that we cannot manage, right, through our physical or digital tools, there's something called risk transfer. And risk transfer is just another word for risk. I think the more that we gather data on the type of risk that exists, we can go to the insurance industry and say, look, people are getting hurt, and it's taking a toll from a healthcare standpoint, or it's taking a toll from a legal standpoint, or it's taking a toll from a social mobility standpoint, and that's affecting our economy's ability to have people transact. All of those have real financial implications. And so the ask to the big insurers of the world, wherever they are in the world, is that you put a price on that risk, because when you start to do that, it incentivizes the lawyers and the engineers to do their jobs better. So I like to think about insurance as the bully in the room. We can use them as a better bully to ensure that everyone else does their job and has adequate money to do their job. So I do think that we need to financialize risk more. I'll stop there though, because I could go on forever about it.
But I think that's a great point. And you're right, mental health was not a conversation, and today it is absolutely an agenda item. Also, like you said, we need infrastructure, and we have to we have to use the risk to finance that infrastructure. A lot of countries are now starting a 4-day work week, and those digital breaks, like we saw last year, we always give our team a complete break at the end of the year, because nothing really happens, and we are not an SOS service, so to speak, so nothing is urgent. I came from aviation where I was handling 24/7. So I don't see ours to be like immediate. But a lot of companies gave their employees 2 weeks or 1 week of complete rest in the middle of the year to cope with the stress of the pandemic. So you're right, it forces us to change, and we must use this to hasten that change in a way. So Bishakha, I want to turn to you. All is not negative, right? You also have seen a lot of positive, inspiring stories from the field, and how people are using the internet to get what they want, especially young people. Can you share some of those? Because otherwise it'll be all dreary and we'll leave this place feeling very negative.
That's always the problem with this conversation, right? It's kind of like a seesaw thing. You have to, balance both sides. But I think everybody realizes, to be honest, the potential of digital technologies, right? Like now when we go to small community groups, which are sort of low-income groups, and they're really used to making their livelihood of what's called in Hindi, Jal Jangal Zameen, which means land, water, forest. Right? We are like, hey, it's not just land, water, forest. You need to say land, water, forest, and cell phone now, because everything flows through the cell phone, right? We saw that again, like your ability to get food during the pandemic, healthcare, information, employment. So I think people do realize that, but I think some of the things that we've seen, which have sort of stuck in my head over the last few years, one is actually during the last 2 years, we trained a group of domestic workers in another city to use mobile phones. And, they were feeling totally left out of the world, basically, right? Because they didn't know how to use these technologies. And what was super interesting actually is many of the women said that they had to rely, and this goes to what James was saying, and sort of the old man and, the young post-millennial. So a lot of them were like, hey, we don't know how to use these phones, so we have to rely on our sons. And our sons are sort of teenagers, and our sons actually are very dismissive of us because we are sort of technologically less literate, right? So that's another sort of piece of it. And then it was very interesting. They were like, you know what? Now, after this 6-month online course, we feel totally confident, and we have even managed to teach our sons a few things. So they really felt it was interesting, not only that they were empowered in the sense of technologically empowered, they actually felt that their gender role in the family shifted, right? Like for once, they were not seen as like, oh, these women who won't be able to like figure out how to use these phones, but they were seen as women who had knowledge, who had something to contribute. So it's kind of interesting, just stuff like this. And similarly, I think there's been, the other thing is actually content creation. I think that's something that's super interesting. Like, again, we've trained a bunch of young women in rural and urban communities in India, but again, they're in low-income communities, right? So again, if you're getting the phone for just like half an hour or 1 hour a day, it's a little hard for you to sort of create content and share it. But if you're not creating content and sharing it on WhatsApp, it's like you don't have a voice on WhatsApp, and WhatsApp is the most widely used platform in India. So just teaching them how to make these little visual, the little forwards we get on WhatsApp. And we actually then started calling it feminist forwards, because a lot of them were in groups where they were sort of getting these sexist comments. You know how there are all these like jokes in inverted commas in India Elsa and Nappinai, you must have seen these, right? Where you're like, oh my God, no, please. But you don't kind of know how to respond to this in that group, like in a funny way or a light way or through a meme.
Yeah.
So we taught them sort of this kind of stuff, and they started feeling like, hey, now we can speak internet, right? Because the truth is the internet has its own language. And so a sense of belonging. So we're seeing a lot of this kind of stuff. But, I wanted to say one thing before I forget, which is what you all were talking about, right? Like that the digital world is not seen as real. Again, we were doing workshops with students in India, and we were talking about consent. And when it came to consent offline, they were like, yes, this is a very serious issue, etc. And then we were like, what about consent online? And they were like, what do you mean consent online? We assume everything is like consensual online, right? So it's kind of different yardsticks, because the places, even though you spend all your time there, somehow it's in a hierarchy. You feel like your physical sort of life is a little more important. Not everybody, but there is some of, the consequences of your actions online, perhaps.
But Bishakha, clearly people think of it as two separate worlds, because think of a parent when they are overwhelmed and can't deal with a cranky kid. What do? They just give the digital device and say,
correct.
Go online. And now kids are on Roblox and other Minecraft and all. And I just spent 2 months with my 2 young nieces, so I know. And they didn't face the violence, but again, so that's another thing. So there's been a case where the BBC reported that a woman was on Roblox, I think, or one of these virtual games, and she was groped virtually, but it affected her in the physical world, that she was so affected, she dropped her console, right? And so that's how, these two worlds are not separate. So parents have to, when you're giving a digital device to a kid, you have to explain to them the pitfalls of it. Just like you tell them about fire hazards, or how do you cross the road, or, how do you talk to strangers? Similarly, if parents don't have that education, then they're not imparting the right instructions to their kids and setting them loose in this wild west in a way. So that comes to Nappinai. I want to talk about the positives of the law, because in India we have digital reporting of crime, so you don't even have to go to the police station. Can you share some of these recent amendments that I think India is leading the way, but we can spend a lot of money explaining to people what remedies are available to them?
Certainly, Elsa. See, because in fact, I also wanted to say that there is also a positive story in law, when you were mentioning to Bishakha. So in Pune, one court decided to show that this process of delays in justice is not necessary. If you put your mind to it, you can have expedited or expeditious closure. So from the time of the police report to the closure of the matter, the court finished a cyber stalking case in just 48 hours. 48 hours flat. Because it's a small case. You have very few witnesses. The witnesses are going to speak to very little things. It's probably most of the time an open and shut case, and there is no reason to drag it out so much. So this court showed how this can be possible. So we just have to wait to see how other courts will also follow suit. And that's why I mentioned in the opening remark also that it is possible. It's just that it needs to be implemented. And the story that you just asked for, or the reality in terms of the anecdote, which you asked for, yes, of course, India is substantially leading the fray in a lot of ways. So what happened was, and there is this case before the Supreme Court, which was dealing with first uploading of rape and gang rape videos, and then added into the scope the issue of child sexual abuse content also. The issue before it was to figure out how you can block these kind of things, or how do you protect victims. When I was appointed as a amicus in the matter, what I had first proposed was this use of artificial intelligence. as a means, because there were enough academic papers which also had done their tests in real time, internet uploads, to show that by using multiple parameters, you can teach AI to be able to identify certain kinds of content like rape or gang rape at an early stage to block it. And what I was proposing was a combination of use of technology and law of free speech. So don't block free speech, but quarantine. And in today's post-COVID world, everybody understands the quarantine, right? So I was saying that it doesn't matter to the world if content is uploaded in 1 hour, 1 second, or after 2 days. Have your human intervention whenever you want. Check if it's news, if it's a movie or a simulated rape, which is supposed to be part of some other, permissible content, then upload it by all means. But if it's an actual rape or gang rape, then it gets blocked. Similar with child sexual abuse content, etc. Now, when this started, it was very contentious because, the whole focus then was on free speech. Few years later, we are sitting in a situation of fake news and hate speech and all of it resulting in loss of lives. And the same thing which I advocated then and which was accepted in part by platforms, but not completely. And even that part was way ahead of its time, talking about 2017. And then it became part of the order of code, where the big tech agreed that they will start the process of research and experimenting whether they can implement. And then that experimentation is now coming in handy to filter out hate speech, or at least to flag and put out warnings where it is identified as fake news. So in the first month of the lockdown, one of the platforms reported several million messages, including original posts and forwards or retweets, etc. kind of thing. Meaning, I'm not saying it was on Twitter. I'm just using that as a colloquialism. They were able to flag it and to show that when somebody was attempting to do that, that exercise of posting or forwarding, they were able to put up a warning saying this has been identified as fake news. So it was almost like you do it at your own risk. So today what we have is post-Prajwala is you have intermediary guidelines of 2021, which provide you remedies without you having to run to court. So you can just go to the platform on which there has been abuse, write to the grievance officer there and seek redressal there. Then simple solutions were found for complex problems. We identified that probably offensive content and such heinous content like rape and gang rape videos being allowed to be uploaded and remaining without being taken down was probably because the reporting mechanism was failing. So we push for, and the consensus proposals form part of that Big Tech agreed to have specific buttons for reporting these kind of crimes, these two kind of crimes. So when someone has a specific button saying child sexual abuse content, there is no platform which can allow it because every country has zero tolerance laws. They can verify later, they can do whatever, but an immediate takedown is mandatory. But all it needed was a specific button. So today, when you go to these platforms, make sure that you choose the right button when you're reporting. The next level, of course, comes police and courts, etc. Section 79, which provides the safe harbor for intermediaries, was relooked. And that now forms part of the intermediary guidelines, which we had discussed at various committees and evolved certain processes, forms part of the intermediary guidelines, that where 79 notice is issued to a platform, they have to comply if they're offering their services in India or for Indians. If they don't, then they lose their safe harbor. These are all remedies which have been evolved, taking into account the kind of offenses that are happening, and also understanding the victim perspective for the first time. We have always had laws which focus more on, and rightly so, human rights, etc. And therefore you have these tried and tested golden thread which said 100 people can go scot-free, but an innocent should not be punished, etc. But today, the law has finally also started looking at the victim rights to say, no victim should go without justice. And that, I think, is an important aspect. And this aspect, which I first proposed in 2017 of use of AI today forms part of India's law. Again, as a voluntary process, and I think that's a huge, huge step. I recollect I was in Chicago for a session on IoT and its risks and threats. At that time, when I switched on the TV, it was just coincidence. Someone was talking about the same problem in the US and how they need certain remedies, which big tech is not providing. And they were talking about the need for responsible technology, etc. And here is India leading the fray and giving solutions to the world, one for taking down identified content expeditiously using crawler technology. Two is that easily reportable buttons, which was an architecture change big tech had to do across the world. It wasn't like it was only for India. And third is use of technology for fighting crime or at least protecting victims. I think these are all huge steps. We are in the right path. We still have a long way to go, but I'm sure we will get there pretty soon.
Thanks, Nappinai, and that's really illuminating. And I know Bishakha is on Facebook's safety board, right? But that comes to, I want to ask James, this is all after the incident has happened. It's an afterthought. How, again, from a risk perspective, how can organizations, institutions, or even entrepreneurs who are collecting data, developing tech, etc., have this in their responsible mindset, like Nappinai said, responsible leadership, that we are going to create systems at the beginning, not after the incident has occurred?
Well, you all make me think about organizations like the International Organization for Standard. Backwardsly, we call them the ISO instead of iOS, we say ISO. But the majority of things that we've done well, again, across borders, we've standardized. And I think when we talk about these sort of issues, whether it's WhatsApp or it's Facebook or it's games, or even like these dating apps, where some of them will have infrastructure built in where you can't take a screen grab of language and pictures that are posted because it doesn't identify consent, right? That can be processed into a standard, right? And so at my core, I was an economist for a while, but my original background, I'm a mechanical engineer, macroeconomist, but the mechanical piece, I think about things more as process. And I think to get ahead of having redress after a problem happens, what the corporate world can do to help the policy world and the legal world is really come together to standardize a lot of these processes, because you're absolutely right. A lot of them can be, the language I like to use is they can be workflowed out of a risky situation, right? So that button as a portable, and that's a really important word in the tech, in the data world now, like data portability is a big deal across platforms because everyone is doing whatever they're doing on platforms. And so you need to not only be able to port your identity in these places, but also the things you would do with your identity, like click a particular button to do a particular thing. A lot of these interactions can be standardized into best practices, dynamic best practices, because everything doesn't fit every locale or every culture, but there can be a certain amount of dynamism tied into international standards that hold all organizations, whether they're a big platform here or there, hold all organizations accountable. And then we can come back and look at the data as regulatory bodies, whether we're on the legal side or whether we're on the actual policy making side, and whether we're educators, et cetera, we can look at it and say, here are the trends that we see. And I agree, AI can do a lot of the work for us. And it's not even just, I think when some people hear that, they think it's identifying pictures or images, but a lot of times AI is also looking at networks. So similarly to how we look at people's history and how they act in the physical world, you can look at how accounts act in the digital world to see clusters of certain type of activity where you see more risk, right? But big companies can afford to pay for that. It's a little bit of code early on, and it could be a best practice roped into a global standard that ensures that people's consent and autonomy are the priority so that it can incentivize safety. So again, on a positive note, because I know you want to end on a positive note, I mean, we can do all of these things. And to be honest, we are doing all these things. We're in, Chicago and Singapore and India and South Africa, making it happen. I just think this work has to, continue. Like it has to be a constant conversation. If it's not the four of us, it's someone else next week. There's someone else that needs to hear this. And for as many problems as we all see out here in the world, I am regularly reassured and excited about the people I meet in the physical and the digital world, just every day. We're getting better. Just as people, we're getting better. There's a lot of crazy stuff out there, but we are getting better. And maybe I should get a Roblox account, because my niece, like yours, she taxes us. Her parents won't pay for it anymore. So now she comes to us, will you buy my stuff? And I look at Roblox stock price and I'm like, should I just buy you shares of Roblox? But that's no fun. Anyway, I'm getting off topic. But so yes, we can use standardization to help the policy apparatus. And I want to be clear, standardization is not policy, but it creates trends that companies can start to aspire to. And you start to see who's close and who's not, and where you may want to regulate or incentivize, government by government, locale by locale, more firms getting up to speed. So there's certainly things that we can do and things that we are doing, but definitely things that we should do more of. And I will say the United States is very behind, and a lot of this digital technology, some of it is due to the political discourse of right now, and some of it is also due to our sort of libertarian culture, which, at least in my opinion, is a bit toxic. That's a separate conversation, but we can do better. So we should be having these conversations. Yeah. So
no, I think this conversation is fascinating. So I just want to ask everyone, does anyone have a question? I think we have time only for one question.
I've got a question.
Yes, Dylan.
So hi, everybody. Thank you so much for this panel. It's been really, really fantastic. And I just had a question. I'd love to hear more from all of you. This is directed to everybody. What you think about the metaverse, Facebook, or actually Meta, and what they're building with the metaverse, and whether there's a possibility for multiple metaverses. Because I think generally people are thinking about the metaverse as one place that Facebook is building, and we're not exactly sure what it's going to look like. But are there possibilities for multiple metaverses to exist? And can we, in the global south, so like, can we, yes, the multiverse, yeah, can we input on this? Is there a possibility for us to still kind of have a real intervention, or is it kind of over in the sense of big tech companies have a lot of the control, and the only ways in which we can input is by helping to make the monoverse a better place in our way, where we're from locally, if you know what I'm saying. So
yeah. I think Bishakha wants to jump in because she's like leading in. So you want to kickstart, and then James.
I think this is a great question, Dylan. And I mean, this is obviously Facebook has like tons of money, tons of power, and, is the first sort of metaverse to get going. My understanding is that there are going to be many more metaverses, and my hope is really that they're not all going to be big tech fueled, right? But I think honestly, like you can't be utopian about it. It does cost a lot of money to make this happen, because the kind of technology that you need to put into place. So remember there were like some experiments with doing alternatives to Twitter, etc. Right? There was something called Twitter, there was Mastodon, etc. All of these are still floating around, and my guess is that we will have alternatives to sort of the Facebook-run metaverse. I think the real question is that are there going to be enough people at all these other metaverses to really make it like that, what we want, like that public space and that kind of, like where all our friends are.
And validation that we are looking great and that we are having fun. And
Right. I think there's a big opportunity. When you ask about the global South, when I think about value as a sort of proxy of energy, right, it really is wherever people are. And so if the majority of people are in the global South, the majority of value is there because there's the potential for the majority of transactions. Like the way energy transpires when friction happens from matter, value happens when transactions occur from people interacting. And we have data that's evidence of those interactions. And so when you think about India, but if you just think about the global South in general, I think it's a huge opportunity. And Facebook, or now Meta, was just trying to brand the metaverse because they want to be a big participant because they know that it's going to get away from them. I would ask everyone to Google play to earn and Google a gaming company called Axis. One of the biggest games, multi-billion-dollar gaming companies on the planet is an Asian company. The majority of their players are in the Philippines. And to define what a multiverse might be, and this may not be the end-all definition, it's really sort of Web3 transactions that you can have totally in a digital space, but they affect your physical life. And so this game, Axis, has $3 billion worth of transactions a year from people buying and building stuff inside the game. And it creates these microcultures in the physical world of them getting together. They're nerdy, if you will, not as a bad word, but as a good word about how they get on. So my point is culture will happen, right? And as Indian culture, for instance, and all the many subcultures within the subcontinent happen, I think there are many opportunities for metaverses to exist. And so it will be like the actual multiverse, like out in I am a believer, and we are not living in a universe, but a multiverse. That's a separate argument. But I think there's a big opportunity for a lot of companies to play and grow big. And let's not forget, Facebook wasn't the first to the game when they started, but their go-to-market was better. Facebook was smaller than MySpace, but the way they engaged is their culture was elitist. So they started at Ivy League schools. They captured who they thought were the cool people. Those cool people bullied the uncools to come over to their side, and then they invested a lot of money to scale. We see that happening in the gaming world, in the metaverse. In my opinion, right now, Facebook and their companies do nothing in the metaverse compared to what the gaming companies do. And the majority of the opportunity is where the majority of the people are. So, maybe that's a shout out to my friends in DC that maybe we need to have 100 million new immigrants come to the United States. That might be a good thing. But the point is there's an opportunity, especially for young people. I'm assuming you're younger in the global South that want to participate.
Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely right, James. And the other thing is, the whole USP of Metaverse is its interoperability. And therefore it cannot act as a dominant player and, block out smaller or larger players in a multiverse. And therefore automatically if it holds good as a construct, as a business proposition, then there is definitely the possibility for growth. And in that, of course, I'll always circle back to the legal aspects. And, I was giving this session on Metaverse just yesterday, and that too in Hindi. Not the most favorite of not the language which is easiest here on my tongue, even otherwise. And to speak about Metaverse in Hindi was doubly daunting. But the one thing I signed off with on that was this, on a lighter side, right? That wherever we see green, the lawyer is always there. And you already have lawyers on the metaverse. So the assumption is that the metaverse is here to stay because the lawyer seems to have seen plenty of green there.
Okay.
Oh, cheers.
So we have completely run out of time. I think we can have a whole session on the metaverse, like Nappinai was speaking yesterday. But I want to end with one very quick round. Bishakha, Nappinai, and then James. What is the one recommendation you have for safe spaces in the Phygital world?
I would say take the space seriously and maybe I would say, we need new things like, for instance, civil laws as well, to really get a number of people to sort of write. Yeah, get the platforms to do more.
Yeah, that's a good one, Bishakha.
Absolutely. So I was in fact going to say responsible technology and platforms understanding their liability too. But I mean, from a legal perspective, yes, I would want more of victim-centric remedies, which are easy and simple to access. That would be my wish list.
I definitely want to see more digital rights that compel these other two things, holding the platforms accountable and actually having those policies in play. And to give anyone an example, when I think about the European continent and the general data protection regulation that hinges on really these three pillars, I think we should add to those pillars, not just have the right to be forgotten, et cetera, but we should also have the right to data portability. We should have the right to digital redress, which brings in those lawyers, which is how it'll be sustainable, but also the right to some form of data ownership so that one can exert themselves as having their property or their physical person, phygital person property harmed. I think those rights compel more legal action. And when you have rights that compel more lawyers to take more action, companies are scared. So again, it goes back, it financializes it, because when lawyers are on the prowl, insurance has to get involved to pay for every time their companies screw up. So again, if we want the lawyers' teeth to come out, we have to have the politicians build in digital bills of rights. And from those digital bills of rights, insurance companies will hold everyone accountable. Because if firms like Meta don't get it right, Zurich Insurance Group will just raise their insurance premiums, and they don't want that, right? So I think we have to use that. So I would want to see that, Elsa. I would want to see a data bill of rights across every platform that makes every individual participant an owner, with the right to redress, the right to be forgotten, the right to portability, and a few others that I'm not remembering right now, but yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Bishakha, Nappinai, and James, for this very interesting discussion. A lot of, fodder for thought. And like you said, James, we need more of these conversations. And like Bishakha said, we must take this space seriously. It's not just a toy or just something alien. It's part of our lives. And Nappinai, continue to keep fighting for stronger legislation. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Dylan, for that lovely question. And thank you, everyone, for sticking around. We will circulate the link to this recording. So please send it to your friends and family, because I think we need to educate ourselves on this topic. Thank you.
Thanks.
And if everyone is comfortable, can they, I'm going to just put everyone on gallery view so that we can take a group picture. So. No one is brave enough. Hi, Suzanne. Okay, 1, 2, 3.
Suzanne.
1, 2, 3. Okay, bye, everyone. Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye.